Chosen one. Have you ever spoken a truth so clear in your spirit, so undeniable in your soul, that others looked at you like you had lost your mind? Have you ever warned someone about a person, a place, or a situation, and they rolled their eyes, mocked your vibe checks, and labeled your intuition as paranoia or delusion, only to watch them later stagger under the weight of what you already knew? Let's talk about it. Let's talk about that deep knowing that you carry. That spiritual radar that detects deception before it ever reveals itself. That sacred frequency that vibrates at the level of truth. Not facts, not logic, not evidence, but truth. And let's really get honest about something most people don't understand. They never had a problem with your intellect. They had a problem with your discernment. They called you crazy because you could see beyond the veil. You could feel the shift in the room before anyone said a word. You could detect betrayal hiding behind a smile. You could sense spiritual warfare erupting behind what looked like normal conflict. And that kind of vision, that kind of spiritual clarity, it terrifies those who are still asleep. Before we dive deep into this message, make sure you like, share, and subscribe, because this isn't just content. It's a divine confirmation for the chosen ones who were labeled crazy until their intuition proved true and shook the entire community. They told you to calm down, to stop being so sensitive, to quit reading too much into things. But they didn't realize that your nervous system was tuned by heaven, that your soul, ancient, eternal, aware, wasn't picking up on drama. It was responding to disharmony in the spirit. See, they don't know what it's like to walk into a room and feel the residue of an argument that happened hours ago. They don't know what it's like to meet someone smiling and polite, but instantly know that spirit isn't right. They don't know what it's like to say, something's off, and have no proof. Just the weight of certainty in your chest. And because they don't know, they judged what they didn't understand. They laughed at what they couldn't feel. They rejected what they weren't ready to receive. They shamed the gift because it made them feel exposed. But chosen one, don't you dare shrink back. Your intuition is not some fragile emotion. It's not a flaw. It's not a weakness. It's a divine instrument. It's your anointing in motion. You were coded for clarity in a world that thrives on confusion. You were gifted perception because you were called to see what others ignore. Your awareness is not a coincidence. It's part of your calling. Think about the times they gaslit you, when you felt something was off, and they told you you were imagining it. When you spoke up, and they told you, you're always overreacting. When you saw behind the mask, and they said, you're being judgmental. But then, it all came crashing down. The truth came to light. And suddenly, everyone was quiet. Those who mocked you, now silent. Those who dismissed you, now searching for your insight. Because the very thing they labeled crazy was the exact thing they needed when the storm hit. You've always known things before they happened. You've always felt things no one else could explain. You've always seen through people before they showed their hand. That's not paranoia. That's prophetic sensitivity, and I need you to stop apologizing for it. You've spent too much of your life explaining your instincts, questioning your own gut, second-guessing your spiritual downloads. But what you thought was anxiety, what you thought was nervousness, what you thought was fear, was actually discernment being ignored. It was your higher self whispering, "Pay attention." It was your spirit guide ringing the alarm. It was God stirring your soul and saying, "Move, chosen one." They didn't reject you because you were wrong. They rejected you because you were right too early. You felt the shift before the shift. You saw the collapse before it cracked. You recognized the energy before it manifested. That kind of spiritual foresight is a threat to a world invested in illusions. But here's what they never tell you about walking with this gift. You'll often see the truth alone. You'll often speak it into a crowd of ears that cannot hear. You'll often feel the shift before the evidence arrives. And in that gap, in that silent, lonely space between knowing and proof, you will be called everything under the sun. Dramatic, negative, judgmental, crazy, too intense, too emotional. But God gave you eyes for what others refuse to look at. You're not too much. You're just too aware. You're not unstable. You're just unwilling to live in denial. You're not difficult. You're just dangerous to deception. You were the one who warned them. You were the one who sensed the betrayal. You were the one who said, "Watch out for that one." You were the one who saw the spirit behind the mask. And they called you crazy until they felt the consequences, until the mask dropped, until the lie exploded, until the truth you sensed walked through the front door and proved you weren't paranoid. Chosen one, do you realize how powerful your gift really is? You are a mirror in a world full of filters, a truth teller in a world of comfortable lies, a frequency breaker in systems built on illusion. And the world doesn't know what to do with that kind of clarity. So they try to discredit it. They try to silence it. They try to label it. But listen to me carefully. Your intuition is not optional. It is essential to your mission. It protects you. It prepares you. It positions you. It preaches for you sometimes without a word. There are people right now who are looking at you with new eyes. The same ones who laughed now watch you in quiet reverence. The same ones who called you crazy now sit in the rubble of what they ignored, and you don't need to say a word. Your presence confirms everything. That's the paradox of the chosen. You are rarely celebrated in real time. Your knowing makes people uncomfortable until it becomes undeniable. You're doubted, dismissed, and mocked until the day you're proven right. And the same crowd falls silent in your clarity. But this isn't about being right. This is about being aligned and chosen one. You've always been aligned with the truth. Even when it cost you connection, even when it brought you isolation, even when it broke your heart, you never stopped seeing. You never stopped feeling. You never stopped discerning. And that is the evidence of your anointing. You didn't choose this gift. It chose you. And with it comes a sacred responsibility to honor your knowing, even when no one else understands. To trust your gut, even when the room tells you you're wrong. To move in silence, even when your spirit is screaming. Because your gift was never about being accepted. It was about being activated. You are not here to fit in. You are here to reveal. You are here to break patterns. You are here to see clearly and walk boldly. And yes, chosen one. Your intuition will always feel crazy to those who are committed to illusion. But you were never crazy. You were called, and now the world is starting to see what heaven always knew. Chosen one. Do you know why they reacted so violently to your truth? Why your calm certainty caused such panic? Why the same people who once smiled in your face began whispering behind your back the moment you spoke what your spirit discerned? It's simple. The world fears what it cannot understand, and you, chosen one, are not meant to be understood by the masses. You were designed to stand out, not blend in. You carry a frequency that makes the counterfeit tremble. You carry a light that exposes what darkness desperately wants to keep hidden. When you walk into a room, things shift, and most people don't even know why. But their spirits do. Their unhealed wounds, their hidden motives, their secret intentions, they all react to the purity of your discernment. They feel seen, exposed, uncomfortable, and instead of confronting their own misalignment, they attack your clarity. It's easier to call you crazy than to admit they're living in denial. It's easier to mock your intuition than to face the truth that their world is built on illusion. That's why, when you told them, something's off, they laughed. But they weren't laughing at you. They were trying to drown out the alarm ringing in their own souls. You were confirmation. And confirmation is confrontational when someone isn't ready to change. See, your gift doesn't just perceive. It provokes. It confronts the spiritual atmosphere. It makes people uncomfortable with their own choices. Because your presence alone says, there's a higher way to live. And not everyone wants to hear that. You shine too bright for the blind. You vibrate too high for the stagnant. You speak too much truth for those still addicted to the lie. And so, they label you. They ridicule you. They whisper about you, not because you're wrong, but because you're right and it threatens the entire foundation they've built their false peace on. Let's get even deeper. Most of the people who rejected your warnings, they weren't just annoyed or they were terrified. Because you saw what they were hoping to hide. You caught the spirit behind their words. You discerned the energy behind their flattery. You felt the manipulation in their kindness, and you called it what it was, false light. You didn't play along. You didn't fall for the charm. You didn't pretend not to notice. And that's when it all shifted. Suddenly, you were too intense. Suddenly, you were negative. Suddenly, you were judging everyone. But in reality, you were just seeing clearly. Chosen one. Understand this. Your spiritual sensitivity disrupts the illusions others depend on. Your discernment is dangerous to deception. Your clarity is a catalyst for exposure, and most people would rather cling to a lie than admit you were right. You've always known you were different. Not better different. Marked. Set apart. While others were distracted by appearances, you were tuned into energy. While others were fooled by words, you listened to tone. While others focused on image, you saw intent. It's not arrogance, it's alignment. You've trained yourself to hear what's not being said, to notice the shift in energy before the words even drop, to feel when a door is spiritually closed, even when it looks wide open. That kind of knowing makes people uneasy, because it means you can't be manipulated. You can't be guilt-tripped. You can't be played. And people who rely on those tactics, they'll do everything they can to discredit you. Not because you're a threat to them physically, but because you're a threat to the version of themselves they want others to believe. And let's be honest, sometimes the opposition comes from those closest to you. Family, friends, church folks, people you once trusted. You told them what you sensed. You tried to explain what your spirit picked up. You weren't trying to stir drama, you were trying to protect them, to guide them, to warn them, but they weren't ready. And instead of thanking you, they made you the enemy. They flipped the script. They isolated you. They painted you as unstable, problematic, even dangerous. Why? Because acknowledging your truth would mean confronting their own illusion. And most people would rather destroy the messenger than receive the message. Chosen one, hear me. They called you crazy not because you lacked evidence, but because you spoke truth before it was popular, before it was safe, before it was proven. You were operating in prophetic timing. You were months, sometimes years ahead of the curve. You saw the patterns forming long before they crystallized. You saw the storm clouds gathering while others were still basking in false sunshine. And when the rain came, when the flood hit, when the fallout began, they remembered your words. They remembered your warning. They remembered that feeling in their chest when you spoke and they didn't listen. And now, they sit quietly, confused, convicted, confronted. Because your so-called paranoia turned out to be prophecy, let me remind you of something powerful. You're not here to be liked. You're here to be aligned. And alignment with truth often puts you at odds with the crowd. But that's okay. You were never called to blend in. You were called to break ground, to sound the alarm, to shake the system, to stir the atmosphere. Your discernment isn't just a personal gift, it's a spiritual assignment. And every time you spoke up, every time you said, "This doesn't feel right," every time you trusted your intuition over appearances, you were fulfilling that assignment, even when it cost you relationships, even when it brought you loneliness, even when it left you wondering if you were the problem. You weren't. You never were. You were the solution walking through a broken environment. You were the truth entering into a system built on lies. You were the clarity confronting confusion. Chosen one. The world is just now catching up to what your spirit already knew. They're seeing now what you felt then. They're learning now what you discerned in silence. They're waking up, but only because you carried the frequency of awakening before it was trendy. And this is why your presence still unsettles people. Because your energy doesn't lie. Your eyes don't miss. Your soul doesn't compromise. You force people to choose alignment or illusion, truth or comfort, freedom or familiarity, and most won't thank you for it. But heaven does. The ancestors do. The remnant rising with you feels it. The ones who are awakening because of your boldness, your light, your truth, they thank you. Because you paved the way. You sounded the alarm. You told the truth when truth was still taboo. And now, chosen one. Your craziness is looking a lot like confirmation. Chosen one. They didn't just misunderstand your intuition. They weren't simply confused by your warnings. They were deeply disturbed because your knowing disrupted their comfort zone. Let that settle for a moment. You didn't just say things that made them uncomfortable. You carried a vibration that made their illusions unsustainable. You called things out, not with accusation, but with presence. You said what others were too afraid to say. And you felt what others were trained to ignore. And in doing so, chosen one, you became a mirror. A living, breathing reflection of truth. A reminder that pretending isn't healing, that masking pain isn't wholeness, that avoiding the issue doesn't stop the consequences from coming. Your intuition didn't just know things. It confronted dysfunction. It shattered facades. It pierced through performance. And for people whose identities are built on appearances, your clarity wasn't just inconvenient, it was dangerous. Think about the patterns you noticed. You were the first to say, "This relationship isn't right." You sensed that leadership figure's manipulation before it became public. You picked up on the quiet jealousy hiding behind compliments. You recognized the spiritual contamination underneath someone's positive vibes. You weren't judging. You were discerning, and they hated it, because they knew you could see past the act, because they knew you weren't fooled, because they knew your presence made it harder for them to pretend. You weren't just breaking social norms, you were disrupting energetic agreements. You were shaking the foundation of what people pretended to believe in. And truth be told, most people aren't interested in healing. They're interested in comfort, in maintenance, in illusion. So when you walked in with your raw, unfiltered truth, they called it too much. They called you intense. But what they really meant was, you see too clearly. And it scares me. Let's go even deeper. There are people who benefit from the lie. Systems built on silence. Relationships built on denial. Churches built on performance. Families built on enabling. And your discernment? It doesn't ask permission. It doesn't wait for people to be ready. It doesn't play politics. It doesn't care about keeping things tidy. When your spirit feels something's wrong, it responds. And that response shakes things. It stirs the air. It uncovers motives. It exposes cycles. Because you were never meant to maintain broken structures. You were sent to disrupt them. So of course they called you crazy. Of course they panicked. Of course they pushed you away. They didn't want truth. They wanted permission to stay asleep. But you, chosen one, you're a divine disruptor. You are heaven's earthquake in a world addicted to stability. You don't just see dysfunction. You call it out, energetically. Even when you don't speak a word. That's why some people started avoiding you. Not because you did anything wrong, but because your presence made it harder for them to keep pretending. Your silence screamed conviction. Your intuition created friction. And your gift made them feel unsafe, not because you were dangerous, but because their illusions were. They say, you changed the energy in the room. But the truth is, you just revealed what was already there. That's why you often feel drained after being around certain people. It's not in your head. Your spirit is doing work sensing, filtering, protecting, decoding. You're spiritually multitasking while smiling, nodding, and holding space. But they don't see that. They just see someone who makes them feel too much. Someone who stirs something they can't explain. Someone whose intuition keeps pointing at what they've buried. And that's why they say, you're too deep. Or, you're reading too much into it. Or the classic, you're always starting something. But chosen one, you're not starting chaos. You're exposing it. You're not creating tension. You're revealing it. You're not tearing things down for fun. You're confronting the foundation that was never stable to begin with. Let's talk about those moments when you tried to ignore what you felt. When you tried to keep the peace. When you told yourself, maybe I'm overreacting. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe it's just me. But the discomfort never left. The tension stayed in your chest. The uneasiness followed you. Because ignoring your intuition doesn't cancel its assignment. Suppressing the signal doesn't make the message disappear. You were always meant to be a warning, a whistleblower in the spirit. Not because you want to stir things up, but because you can't stand to see truth buried beneath pretense. And every time you tried to fit in, every time you tried to ignore that spiritual tug, you found yourself sick, anxious, confused, out of alignment. Because pretending to not know what you do know will always cost you more than speaking up. Chosen one, stop apologizing for disrupting people's comfort. You didn't come here to be agreeable. You came here to be authentic. You didn't come to maintain dysfunction. You came to liberate. You didn't come to blend in. You came to shift the atmosphere. And when you do that, when you walk in your truth, when you speak from your knowing, when you obey your discernment, you will inevitably cause reactions, spiritual friction, energetic resistance, social backlash. And that's okay, because the discomfort you cause is often the only thing that will provoke transformation. You weren't sent to be liked. You were sent to awaken. Think about it. You've walked away from jobs, relationships, churches, and circles, not because they were obviously wrong, but because something just didn't sit right in your spirit. You couldn't explain it, but you couldn't shake it. And later, sometimes weeks, sometimes years, the truth came out. Everything your intuition whispered was confirmed. Every warning your spirit gave proved true, and people looked at you with wide eyes. They said, "How did you know?" They said, "I should have listened." They said, "You were right." But by then, you had already paid the price. You'd already walked through the rejection, the loneliness, the self-doubt. But guess what? Your knowing didn't come to shame them. It came to free them. You weren't trying to control. You were trying to protect. You weren't seeking conflict. You were offering clarity, and that's why heaven backs you. That's why your intuition is growing stronger. Because you've proven that you'll obey even when it costs you comfort. Chosen one, let this be your reminder. Your gift is disruptive by design. It was never meant to make people comfortable. It was meant to call people higher, to confront the lie, to break the spell. You didn't ruin the energy. You revealed it. You didn't bring drama. You exposed the one who did. And while the world called you too much, heaven called you anointed. While they labeled you crazy, heaven whispered, seer. So trust your knowing, even when it costs you, especially when it costs you. Because what feels like rejection now is actually protection for what you're becoming. You were never here to play along. You were here to break cycles, to disrupt what others normalize, to activate what others suppress. Your intuition didn't just make people uncomfortable. It shook the very ground they stood on. And that chosen one is the kind of knowing that changes the world. Chosen one. There was a time when the silence became unbearable, when the phone stopped ringing, when the invitations dried up, when the ones you once called friends faded into shadows. You looked around and asked yourself, did I do something wrong? Was it something I said? Why does everyone seem to leave once I start trusting my intuition? But the answer, chosen one, is this: the isolation wasn't punishment. It was protection. What looked like abandonment was actually a divine recalibration. What felt like rejection was God building a sanctuary around your spirit. Because when your intuition grows, so does your sensitivity. And with that sensitivity comes a necessary separation. You weren't being punished. You were being preserved. See, when you began to see the truth about people, when you felt the hidden agendas, when you started recognizing spiritual misalignments in your closest circles, you weren't going crazy. You were waking up. And that awakening requires silence, stillness, distance. Because it's in that distance that your gift sharpens. It's in that solitude that your inner voice gets louder. It's in that silence that you hear God more clearly than ever. Chosen one, what you called loneliness, was actually sacred training, a spiritual incubation. You were being protected from the noise, from the drama, from the fake alliances, from the energetic parasites. You were being removed from rooms that couldn't hold your frequency. Because some atmospheres are so contaminated with ego, envy, and spiritual confusion, they start to mute your discernment. And God wasn't about to let that happen. That's why people began to fall off when your intuition started rising. That's why old friends stopped calling when you started seeing through the masks. That's why relationships fell apart the moment you trusted your gut instead of their excuses. Because your discernment disrupts comfort zones. And people don't like being read by someone they can't manipulate. You weren't mean. You weren't cold. You just stopped playing the game. And once you stopped pretending not to see, they had no choice but to leave. You didn't change to hurt them. You evolved to protect your own peace. Chosen one. Don't mourn what walked away. Celebrate what your spirit could no longer tolerate. Some people were only attached to the version of you that doubted yourself. The you that second-guessed your gift. The you that needed their validation. But the moment you stood in your knowing, they vanished. Because your awakening forced a confrontation they weren't ready for. When you stopped accepting confusion, they called you difficult. When you stopped ignoring energy shifts, they called you dramatic. When you stopped silencing your spirit, they said you were changing. Yes, you did change. You aligned. You upgraded. You got in tune with the divine voice inside you. And those who were committed to pretending couldn't survive in your clarity. Remember those moments when you sat alone with tears in your eyes, wondering why no one got you? That was sacred ground. That was the wilderness where your discernment sharpened, where your spiritual gifts matured, where you learned how to hear God without noise, where you were stripped of every false connection that tried to wear the mask of loyalty. Isolation didn't come to hurt you. It came to heal you, to pull you out of codependent patterns, to disconnect you from emotional manipulation, to remove you from systems that rewarded your silence and punished your sight. You were never meant to stay in those rooms. You were always meant to walk out with vision. And when you walked out, heaven sealed the door behind you. Chosen one. Listen closely. Your gift is loud in the spirit realm. It rings like a trumpet. It calls things out. It shakes atmospheres. And that kind of frequency can't be carried in casual company. You can't sit in circles where gossip is entertainment. You can't stay connected to people who love you more when you're confused than when you're clear, because clarity costs you comfort. Discernment isolates you from delusion, but you weren't born to be popular. You were born to be set apart. There are those who thought you'd break when they left, who thought your silence meant defeat, who thought your absence meant surrender. But they misunderstood the power of sacred solitude. Because while they thought you were drowning in isolation, you were being refined, fortified, anointed. You were in the fire, but the fire didn't burn you. It activated you. And now, when you walk into a room, you carry authority. Not because you fought for attention, but because you paid the price of purification. Your silence wasn't weakness. It was warfare. Your quiet season wasn't passive. It was prophetic. You weren't hiding. You were healing. So let's reframe the story. The people who left weren't meant to stay. The ones who mocked your intuition weren't ready to hear. The spaces you were removed from were never your assignment in the first place. You were never meant to be understood by the crowd. You were meant to carry insight for the remnant, and the remnant doesn't gather in popularity contests. The remnant finds each other in wilderness places, in silence, in stillness, in spiritual frequency. So if you're still alone, don't panic. You're not abandoned. You're being aligned. Your tribe. They're awakening too. Your people. They're hearing this frequency. The ones who will honor your gift, they're coming. But God had to remove the noise first. The familiar, the counterfeit, the distracting. He had to clear the space so the right connections could enter. Chosen one, your isolation was holy. It was a cocoon, not a coffin. A rebirth, not a punishment. And now, you walk in a level of knowing that can't be taught. Because you lived it. You survived the season of silence. You endured the exile. You trusted your discernment, even when it cost you everything. And now you carry authority. You've graduated in the Spirit. The same people who left you alone in your awakening will witness your rising, because you didn't die in the silence. You transformed. And transformation is what separates the chosen from the crowd. Chosen one, you remember what they said, don't you? Stop overthinking. You're making a big deal out of nothing. You're just imagining things. But deep down, you knew something wasn't right. Something was coming. And it wasn't fear speaking. It was prophetic clarity. It was your spirit aligning with a divine shift that most couldn't feel until it hit them in the face. You saw the cracks before the collapse. You heard the rumbling before the thunder. You felt the spiritual pressure building long before anything manifested in the natural. And now, the shift they denied has become unavoidable. The energy you warned about, it erupted. The danger you sensed, it revealed itself. The transformation you foresaw, it swept through, leaving no stone unturned. And those who mocked your intuition, those who rolled their eyes, those who called you dramatic, they're standing in the wake of the truth you tried to tell them. Chosen one. This is your confirmation. You weren't crazy. You were calibrated. You were aligned with a movement in the spirit that others couldn't yet perceive. You were ahead of the curve because you weren't moving by logic. You were moving by frequency. You were picking up on shifts in the atmosphere that hadn't reached the surface. But just because others couldn't feel it, doesn't mean it wasn't real. You were the lighthouse on a foggy shore, the trumpet before the battle, the early warning system coded by heaven to announce the change before it arrived. And now the change is here. And everyone who ignored the signs can't deny them anymore. Think back to the signs you felt. The conversations that disturbed your peace. The patterns that screamed danger. The relationships that began to rot. Even though everything looked fine on the outside. You didn't have proof. You had presence. You had the Holy Spirit whispering. Pay attention. You had your ancestors pushing you to move. You had dreams, visions, synchronicities that couldn't be explained away. And still, they dismissed you. But now, everything has shifted. The very ones who told you to stop being so deep, they're searching for answers. They're panicked. They're desperate for the insight you were offering all along. Because while they were focused on comfort, you were tuning into truth. And truth doesn't ask for agreement. It just shows up, and when it does, it brings clarity and consequences. Do you realize how powerful you are? Chosen one. You moved before the flood. You prepared before the famine. You exited before the fall. You sensed the betrayal before the mask slipped. You pivoted before the chaos. That's not coincidence. That's not paranoia. That's prophetic intelligence. That's what happens when you operate in the divine dimension. And now, the shift has exposed what was hidden. The things you discerned, they're all surfacing. The spirits you felt behind the smiles, they're showing their true face. The things you couldn't quite articulate. The warnings you tried to give with no evidence. They are now obvious to everyone. And that's why the silence around you is getting louder. Because those who discredited your voice now live in the consequences of ignoring it. Chosen one, don't gloat. Don't say, "I told you so." That's not your spirit. You carry too much compassion for that. You warned them because you cared. You tried to stop the damage before it hit. But they weren't ready to hear you then. And now, they remember everything you said. They replay your words. They feel the echo of your discernment. Because the very thing they rejected is now the thing they respect. And they're realizing you were never speaking from ego. You were speaking from alignment. Let's be clear. This shift didn't come to punish you. It came to prove you. God let the truth unfold so you'd no longer question your knowing. So you'd stop shrinking to make others feel comfortable. So you'd trust your spirit over their opinions. This is your spiritual vindication. Not to prove others wrong, but to finally give yourself permission to stand fully in your power. To stop apologizing for your awareness. To stop second-guessing your insight. To stop dimming your light just to be tolerated by people who fear illumination. Because now, the truth can't be denied. And your intuition has been verified by reality. Chosen one, the shift has just begun. Everything is being rearranged. Old systems are crumbling. Hidden agendas are being exposed. False alignments are breaking apart. And those who operated in shadows can no longer hide. You're ahead of the curve. You're the blueprint. You're the one others are now looking to, wondering how you knew, how you moved, how you escaped the storm they're still stuck in. And the answer is simple. You listened. You listened to your intuition when no one else did. You obeyed the nudge. You trusted the tug. You followed the whisper. And that obedience saved you. You were designed to walk by spiritual vision, not human validation. And now, heaven is showing you what happens when you trust the inner voice more than the outer noise. The shift others called fantasy became your reality. The prophecy they called imagination became your protection. The urgency they labeled anxiety became your anointing. And now that the shift is here, the same world that called you crazy is watching in awe. They see your peace. They see your preparation. They see how nothing surprised you, how nothing shook you, how you walked with calm in the chaos, because you weren't reacting to life. You were responding to spirit. So what's next? Now that the shift is undeniable, now that your discernment has been validated, now that you no longer doubt your knowing, you step into authority, not just insight, not just awareness, authority. You carry the weight of one who obeyed the whisper in the wilderness. You carry the clarity of one who didn't need proof to pivot. You carry the grace of one who heard the warning, took it seriously, and moved. And from now on, when others question your knowing, you won't panic. You won't explain. You won't beg to be understood, because now you understand. Your spirit is your compass. Your intuition is your protection. Your gift is your guide. And the shift was never the punishment. The shift was your promotion, chosen one. You've felt the eyes, haven't you? The quiet glances, the long stares from across the room, the sudden interest from people who once mocked, ignored, or dismissed you. You've noticed how the energy changed. Those who used to speak over you now listen closely. Those who called you dramatic now watch you with silent reverence. Those who said you were too much now mimic your moves, mirror your language, study your steps, because now they watch what they once mocked. Let that truth sink deep into your soul. You didn't ask for applause. You didn't seek validation. You didn't demand recognition. You just kept trusting your intuition, following your inner compass, moving when the Spirit said move, staying quiet when others wanted noise, standing still when the world was spinning. And now, chosen one, the fruit of your discernment speaks louder than their judgment ever could. The same people who rolled their eyes now scroll your page looking for wisdom. The same ones who laughed behind your back now whisper your name in admiration. The same ones who doubted your Spirit-led decisions now wonder how you always knew what they couldn't see. They used to call you strange. Now they call you gifted. They used to say, "You're too deep." Now they ask, "How did you know?" And here's what you need to understand. You were never seeking revenge. You were simply being real in a world addicted to illusions. They weren't ready for your clarity. They weren't ready for your frequency. They weren't ready for your level of spiritual truth. But now that the consequences of ignoring it are manifesting, they're being forced to reckon with what you carried all along. Chosen one, you've become a living confirmation, a walking testimony, an undeniable reflection of spiritual alignment. You didn't argue. You didn't retaliate. You didn't clap back. You let time reveal what your intuition already knew. You let the truth do what truth always does stand. And now, the ones who couldn't receive your warnings are watching you walk in peace while they stumble through the chaos you tried to help them avoid. They thought you were just lucky. They thought it was coincidence. They thought you were just different. But what they didn't see was the cost of your clarity. The nights you cried in secret. The isolation you endured. The hours you spent praying, fasting, seeking, decoding energies you couldn't explain in words. The warfare that hit you every time you spoke truth in a room addicted to lies. You weren't just born with insight. You battled for it, and now they study you from a distance. They mimic your movements. They borrow your language. They start talking about energy and alignment and discernment words they once said were weird, new age, or too much. But you know what? That's what happens when a forerunner walks through. That's what happens when the first voice in the room speaks what everyone else was too scared to say. You weren't loud for attention. You were clear for purpose. You weren't rebellious. You were revelatory. And now they realize you were never trying to stand out. You were just standing true. There's a strange silence that follows spiritual vindication. Not applause, not celebration, but reverence. The ones who judged you no longer speak. Not because they've changed, but because they're now aware that they misread you. They realize that your silence wasn't passivity, it was wisdom. That your boundaries weren't rejection, they were protection. That your distance wasn't pride, it was preservation. You didn't move like them because you weren't called like them. And now the fruit speaks. The alignment is visible. The shift is undeniable. And while they may never say it aloud, they know you were right. You were ahead. You were chosen. But here's the power in it all. You never needed them to say it. Your spirit was never waiting on external validation. You've been walking with heaven's approval all along. And now that others see it, that's just confirmation, not permission. Let them watch. Let them wonder. Let them reflect. Because you weren't placed here to be understood. You were placed here to be undeniable. Your life is now doing the speaking. Your discernment is now bearing fruit. Your past warnings are now current realities. And that chosen one is something no mockery can undo. So don't shrink just because people are watching now. Don't start over-explaining. Don't return to old circles just because they finally see you. Stand in your growth. Stand in your clarity. Stand in the version of you that never needed the applause to be obedient. Because this isn't about vindication. This is about vibration. This is about frequency. This is about divine assignment. And you, chosen one, have graduated. You've elevated to a level where you no longer need to prove, because your very presence is proof. The healed you, the grounded you, the discerned you, the aligned you. That's what they're seeing now. That's what they once mocked and now mimic, because you didn't just say the storm was coming. You outlasted it. You prepared for it. You guided others through it. And now, you've become the blueprint they never saw coming. Chosen one. Don't be surprised when the same people who discredited your intuition now ask for your insight. Don't be shaken when those who laughed at your convictions now lean in for guidance. Don't be offended when they quote what you've been saying all along as if they discovered it. Just smile. Just nod. Just continue walking in grace, because while they mocked your message, they now move by your blueprint. And that's the power of the chosen. You don't fight to be seen. You simply let time reveal the truth. And now, your truth has become undeniable. Chosen one. You've been through the fire. You've walked through the silence. You've endured the mockery, the rejection, the doubt. You've watched people misread your heart, mislabel your gift, misunderstand your silence. But today, let me remind you of a truth so simple, yet so sacred. You were never the threat. You were always the alarm. You didn't create the chaos. You sensed it. You didn't summon the storm. You were sent to announce it. You didn't bring darkness. You brought the light that revealed it. And when the world couldn't handle the message, they targeted the messenger. They said you were too much, too intense, too emotional, too sensitive. But all that time, you were simply accurate. You were tuned in. You were aligned. You were walking in a knowing that went beyond understanding. Because chosen one, you don't operate by what you see. You move by what you discern. Let's reflect for a moment. You were the first to notice the shift in someone's spirit. The first to say, something's not right here. The first to catch the off-key frequency behind pretty words. The first to feel the weight in a room before anyone said a word. And what did they do? They called you crazy. They minimized you. They tried to silence what your soul couldn't ignore. But now the very things you warned about are unraveling. The truth is marching out in full display. And the same people who questioned your discernment are now adjusting their lives because of the exact thing you tried to tell them. Chosen one. Your intuition shook the entire environment. Not because you're destructive, but because you carry divine detection. You were always here to shake things, to stir, to awaken, to activate. You were sent ahead not to blend in, but to break patterns. Not to comfort illusions, but to crack them open. Not to soothe dysfunction, but to call it by name. And yes, your presence disrupted the system, but only because the system wasn't stable to begin with. You are a code breaker in a realm that thrives on encryption. You were given eyes to see what others ignore. You weren't just called to recognize the truth, you were called to embody it. That's why people reacted to you the way they did. It wasn't personal. It was spiritual. Their spirits recognized your frequency before their minds could make sense of it. They felt seen. They felt exposed. They felt convicted. And instead of embracing the light, they called it darkness. Instead of honoring your knowing, they labeled it madness. But now that the dust has settled, your clarity has become the cornerstone. Your insight has become the roadmap. Your voice once ignored is now echoing in their memory, ringing louder with every revelation. So where does that leave you now? It leaves you validated. It leaves you anointed. It leaves you standing tall in the truth you always carried, truth that required no applause to be real, no audience to be powerful. You are no longer trying to prove anything. You are simply walking in authority. You've earned this clarity. You've stewarded this discernment. You've protected your gift in a world that tried to convince you it didn't exist. And now, you're not just intuitive. You're impactful. You're not just aware. You're aligned. And you don't need them to understand your journey because you finally understand it yourself. Chosen one. The path you walk isn't common. It's narrow. It's sacred. It's lonely at times, but never without purpose. You were born for the remnant, not the crowd. You were called to those who would resonate deeply, not to those who only listen to be entertained. And that's why your experiences are so different. That's why your knowing is so precise. That's why your spirit picks up what others miss. Because you're not here to go along. You're here to guide, to confirm, to activate. And those who were ready, they felt you. They heard you. They knew. The rest, they'll remember you when it matters most. When everything you said starts to unfold. When every warning becomes prophecy fulfilled. When every boundary becomes a lesson learned. But even then, you don't need the credit. Because you were never doing it for recognition. You were doing it out of obedience. You were moving by spirit, and spirit always knows. So as this chapter closes and your clarity strengthens, hold this truth close. You were never crazy. You were never too much. You were never the problem. You were the confirmation. You were the alarm. You were the light. You were the truth. And they know it now. Let them watch. Let them wonder. Let them remember. Because you were never wrong for trusting your intuition. You were chosen to carry truth. And now that truth is shaking everything it touches. You were always the signal. And now, the whole world is starting to hear what you heard long ago. Chosen one. Let your heart be still. Let your soul exhale. Let the tears fall if they need to, because this is your confirmation. You were never crazy. You were never imagining it. What you felt was real. What you saw was accurate. What you knew in your spirit was divinely placed there, not by chance, not by emotion, but by design. You were sent here to discern, to detect, to feel what others suppress, to speak what others fear, to know what others cannot articulate. And yes, it's been heavy. Yes, it's cost you friends. Yes, it's made you question your own sanity at times. But look at what's unfolding. Look at the truth you carried. Look at the way your warnings became waves. Look at how heaven backed you again and again. You don't need to scream. You don't need to fight. You don't need to chase validation. You just need to be. Because who you are is already confirmation enough. So walk with peace. Walk with grace. Walk with the assurance that everything in your life is aligning exactly as it should. The lonely nights, the silent seasons, the confused faces, all of it led you to this moment. And now, your path is clear. You are guided. You are protected. You are elevated. Chosen one. If this message resonated with you, don't keep it to yourself. hit that subscribe button, like the video, drop a comment below, and share it with someone who needs to hear this. Your voice is not an echo, it's a trumpet. Your truth is not strange, it's sacred. And your life is not random, it's royal. God bless you.